The stones that remember the sky. There is a place where the earth meets the heavens in silence. It is not marked on maps with ceremony. No golden plaques announce its purpose. Yet those who come here across windswept moors where grass bends like prayer feel it immediately. Something older than language waits in the arrangement of stone. Something that knew the sky before we named the constellations, before we built cities or planted fields or wrote the first symbols into clay. The megaliths rise from the plain like sentinels carved by time itself. They are not smooth, not decorated with the flourishes of later civilizations. They are rough-hewn, weathered by millennia of rain and frost, their surfaces mapped with lichen in shades of silver and green. Some stand alone, solitary as monks in meditation. Others form circles, their spacing deliberate, their shadows falling in patterns that shift with the turning year. In the moments before dawn, when mist clings low to the ground and starlight still holds dominion over the eastern horizon, these stones seem almost to breathe. It is said they were raised by people who had no metal, no wheels, no beasts of burden strong enough to move such weight. Yet move them they did, hauling blocks of bluestone across distances that would challenge modern machinery, positioning them with a precision that suggests not haste, but devotion. This was not the work of a single generation. This was the labor of centuries. Knowledge passed from parent to child in an unbroken chain of sky watchers who understood that the heavens moved in cycles that could be measured, predicted, honored. We know this because the stones themselves remember. On the morning of the summer solstice, when the sun rises at its northernmost point along the horizon, its light threads through carefully positioned gateways of stone. The alignment is exact, not approximate, not close enough exact, as if whoever placed these megaliths understood geometry with an intuition that borders on the mystical. The winter solstice brings its own revelation, moonrise casting shadows that appear only once in a generation, marking cycles most of us have forgotten to watch. These are not accidents. They are calculations rendered in the most permanent medium available, stone that would outlast bronze, that would survive long after the voices that raised it had faded into legend. Beneath the silence of these plains lies a question that astronomers still cannot fully answer. How? How did Bronze Age communities, working without written mathematics, without telescopes or sextants, track celestial movements with such accuracy? How did they predict eclipses, those moments when the sun's face darkens or the moon bleeds red, events that require understanding of orbital mechanics we assume belonged only to later ages? The Metonic cycle, that elegant 19-year pattern reconciling solar and lunar calendars, is encoded in the placement of stones at some of these sites. Yet we found no tablets explaining the calculation, no diagrams showing the method. Only the stones themselves, arranged in circles within circles, their spacing hiding ratios and relationships that took modern archaeoastronomers decades to decode. Perhaps they did not need to write it down. Perhaps the knowledge was held differently, embedded in ritual, in song, in the rhythm of processions that wound between standing stones at dawn. We can imagine them, figures robed against the morning cold, moving in patterns that mirrored the stars turning wheel above. Voices lifted in languages that have left no descendants, no translations, no way for us to hear their cadence, except in the lonely cry of wind across the moors. What prayers did they speak? What names did they give the planets that wandered among the fixed stars? What stories did they tell about the patterns they saw written in the heavens? The hunter, the bear, the pathway of souls ascending after death. The stones do not answer. They stand in their ancient silence, holding secrets the way granite holds the memory of pressure and heat. There is mathematics hidden here, encoded not in symbols, but in physical space. The spacing between certain stones creates ratios that align with astronomical periods. The diameter of inner circles compared to outer rings echoes the relationship between solar and lunar years. Modern astronomers, standing among these megaliths with their instruments and equations, express a kind of reverent bewilderment. The precision should not be possible, not with Stone Age tools, not without writing to preserve the data, not without metal to create measuring devices of sufficient accuracy. Yet here the stones stand, their alignments demonstrable, their celestial purpose beyond reasonable doubt. We are forced to confront the probability that ancient peoples possessed astronomical knowledge more sophisticated than our timelines usually allow, that they watched the sky with a patience and dedication that has almost vanished from our hurried world. What compelled such devotion? Was it religious, this tracking of heavens? Did they believe the gods dwelt among the stars, their movements dictating the rhythm of earthly life? Or was it practical, a calendar written in stone, marking seasons for planting and harvest, times for gathering and times for migration? Perhaps these motivations cannot be separated. Perhaps for them, the sacred and the practical were woven together as completely as moonlight and shadow, each defining the other. The rituals that unfolded here have left traces in the earth itself. Excavations revealed deposits of bone and ash, remnants of feasting and ceremony. Cremated remains were placed within the stone circles, suggesting these were not merely observatories, but also temples, places where the boundary between earth and sky, between living and dead, grew permeable. On nights of particular astronomical significance, fires would have burned between the stones, their light competing with starlight, smoke rising like prayers into the darkness above. We can almost hear the drums, the slow processional rhythm matching the heartbeat of the earth itself. We can almost see the dancers moving between stones, their shadows long in firelight. We can almost remember what it meant to live beneath the sky. We watched with such intimacy that we knew the stars like the faces of family, but we cannot quite reach them. That knowledge has slipped beyond the horizon of memory. The people who raised these stones are anonymous now. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know their myths except as fragments reconstructed from burial goods and the positioning of monuments. We do not know their songs. The languages they spoke died without leaving children, and with them went the words they used for constellation and solstice, for sacred and sky. What remains are the stones themselves, rough granite sentinels still keeping watch, still marking time even though no one remembers why they matter. On certain nights, when the moon is full and the moors are silent, you can stand among these megaliths and feel the weight of their patience. They have outlasted empires. They have watched languages bloom and fade. They have seen religions rise and fall, gods worshipped and then forgotten, entire ways of understanding the cosmos replaced by new systems, new stories, new attempts to make sense of the wheeling heavens above. And still they stand, still aligned, still measuring cycles most of us never notice. The stars they were built to track are still there, their patterns shifted slightly by the slow precession of Earth's axis, but recognizable, eternal in their dance. The sun still rises through the stone gateways on the summer solstice, its light touching the same rock face it has illuminated for 4,000 years. The seasons still turn. The moon still follows its complicated path across the sky, sometimes brightening to fullness, sometimes vanishing entirely into shadow. But the voices that knew why, that understood the deep significance of these alignments, that could read the sky like scripture, those voices have faded into the breath of wind across empty moors. They have joined the silence that pools between the stones at twilight, when shadows lengthen and the first stars begin to appear. What remains is mystery rendered in the most enduring form available: stone marking sky, earth remembering heaven, silence holding space for questions we can ask but never fully answer. Some truths are not meant to be recovered. Some knowledge is sacred precisely because it is lost. And perhaps, in the end, that is its own kind of wisdom, standing before these ancient stones, acknowledging that we do not and cannot know everything, that some secrets belong to the people who kept them, and that the proper response to such mystery is not frustration but reverence. The stones remember the sky. They have always remembered, and they will continue their vigil long after we, too, have faded into starlight and dust. The library they could not save. There is smoke rising from the harbor. It drifts across the Mediterranean in columns of gray and black, carrying with it something more precious than cedar or silk or the spices that filled the merchant vessels moored along Alexandria's quays. What burns tonight is not cargo. What turns to ash in the flames is memory itself, the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the careful observations of minds that sought to understand the heavens and the earth, the body and the soul, the nature of numbers and the structure of reality. The Library of Alexandria is burning. Or perhaps it burned long ago. Or perhaps it never burned at all but faded slowly, scroll by scroll, as budgets dwindled and scholars departed and the great halls grew silent. History offers us multiple endings, none entirely certain, all of them tragic in their own way. What we know with certainty is this: there was a place, once, where humanity gathered everything it had learned, and then that place was gone. It is said that the library held 700,000 scrolls at its height, though some whispers speak of numbers even greater, approaching 1,000,000 texts rolled and shelved in cedar cases, protected from moisture and insects, catalogued with a care that suggested their keepers understood they were preserving not just information, but the very mind of civilization. These were not idle collections, not decorative possessions displayed to demonstrate wealth. These scrolls were working documents referenced daily by scholars who came from across the known world to study in Alexandria's halls, to debate in its courtyards, to add their own observations to the great conversation humanity was having with itself about the nature of existence. Imagine the halls as they might have been in those golden centuries when Alexandria stood as the intellectual heart of the world. The morning light enters through high windows, falling in dusty shafts across tables where papyrus scrolls lie open, their surfaces covered in Greek letters rendered in ink made from soot and gum Arabic. The air smells of paper and lamp oil, of the sea salt carried on breezes from the harbor, of the particular mustiness that accumulates wherever knowledge is stored. Scholars move between the shelves with the quiet reverence of priests attending to sacred mysteries. And in a sense, that is what they are: priests of understanding, devotees of truth, servants to the accumulated wisdom of everyone who came before. Here, in these halls, Eratosthenes once sat with his measurements and his geometry, calculating the circumference of the earth, using nothing more than shadows, angles, and pure reason. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun stood directly overhead in Syene, casting no shadow. He knew that in Alexandria, 500 miles north, the sun cast a shadow even at that precise moment. From the angle of that shadow and the distance between cities, he derived the planet E's circumference with an accuracy that would not be improved upon for 1,000 years. His calculations survived in fragments, quoted by later writers, but his complete works, his methodology, his other discoveries, these burned with the library, or rotted, or were lost in ways we can no longer trace. In another chamber, Aristarchus proposed something that would seem heretical, impossible, contrary to all common sense: that the Earth was not the center of the cosmos, that our planet orbited the sun, rather than the reverse. 17 centuries before Copernicus would be celebrated for this insight, an Alexandrian scholar had already reasoned it out, had already seen past the evidence of his senses to the deeper truth that our perspective deceives us. His heliocentric model existed in manuscripts stored in the library's collection, but those manuscripts did not survive the library's destruction. When Copernicus finally arrived at the same conclusion, he did so without benefit of Aristarchus's work, forced to reason through problems that had already been solved, to fight battles that had already been won. What else was lost? The question haunts like a ghost in empty halls. Complete histories of Alexander's campaigns written by those who marched beside him, who witnessed the battles and the negotiations, who knew the man behind the legend, all reduced to fragments quoted in later works, references without context, summaries that can never capture the detail and nuance of the original texts. Sophocles wrote over 120 plays, of which 7 survive complete. Where are the others? Some were likely stored in Alexandria, copied and preserved by librarians who understood their literary value. When the library vanished, so did those plays, leaving us with gaps in our understanding of Greek tragedy that can never be filled. Medical texts describing surgical procedures that would not be attempted again until the Renaissance. Astronomical tables tracking planetary movements with a precision that suggests centuries of careful observation. Treatises on mathematics, geometry, engineering, the accumulated technical knowledge of civilizations from Egypt to Persia to India, all gathered in one place, all available to scholars who could cross-reference, compare, build upon what had been learned. The library was not merely storage. It was a machine for generating new knowledge, a place where information from disparate sources could be brought into conversation, where patterns could emerge, where understanding could deepen. And then it was gone. The burning, if it was a burning, might have happened in stages. Julius Caesar's fleet in the harbor, flames spreading from ships to warehouses to the library district. Or Aurelian's battles in the 3rd century. Or the Christian mob in 391, destroying what they saw as pagan knowledge, dangerous wisdom that competed with revealed truth. Or simply, the slow decay of centuries. Budgets cut, scholars departing, scrolls crumbling from neglect as the city that had once been the world's intellectual capital turned its attention elsewhere, forgot its purpose, allowed the halls to empty one by one. Perhaps all of these endings are true in their way. Perhaps the library died as most great institutions die, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a long, slow decline, pieces of it lost to fire and flood and indifference. Until finally, there was nothing left but references in other texts, memories of a place that once existed, echoes of the wisdom that had been housed there. The emotional weight of this loss is difficult to fully comprehend. Each scroll represented years of work, observation, experimentation, thought translated into words, knowledge that someone had devoted their life to acquiring and recording. A medical text might contain the culmination of a physician's career, every remedy and procedure learned over decades of practice. An astronomical table might represent generations of sky watchers, each adding their observations to charts that grew more accurate with each passing year. A philosophical treatise might be the result of a lifetime of contemplation, an attempt to articulate truths about existence that the author had slowly, painfully discovered. All of that, the labor, the devotion, the careful attention, turned to ash, or mold, or dust. We are left with ghosts. Later scholars, working from surviving fragments, have attempted to reconstruct what was lost. They find references in texts that survived, a physician quoting a medical treatise that no longer exists, a geographer citing astronomical measurements that have vanished, a philosopher arguing against positions we know only through their rebuttals. From these scattered references, we can sketch the outline of what once existed in Alexandria's halls, like archaeologists reconstructing a building from foundation stones and fragments of wall. But we can never recover the detail, the fullness, the actual content of those lost works. Imagine standing in the ruins of the library district, centuries after the flames died, or the last scroll rotted, or the final scholar departed. The buildings themselves are gone now, reused for other purposes, or collapsed into rubble. The harbor is still there, boats still coming and going, merchants still trading goods from across the Mediterranean. But the knowledge that once filled these streets, the conversations that once echoed in these halls, that is gone beyond recovery. Some believe the loss set human understanding back by centuries. If those astronomical tables had survived, if those medical texts had been available, if the engineering treatises and mathematical proofs had been preserved, perhaps the Renaissance would have arrived sooner. Perhaps we would have reached the moon in the 17th century rather than the 20th. Perhaps diseases we struggled to cure would have been understood and treated earlier. The library's destruction might represent not just the loss of what was known, but the delay of what could have been discovered, had the knowledge been preserved. But there is another way to understand this loss, one that brings its own strange comfort. The fact that humans rebuilt, that we slowly, painfully recovered much of what was lost, that we kept asking questions and making observations and recording our understanding. This suggests something resilient in the human spirit, something that refuses to accept ignorance, even when libraries burn. The knowledge that was lost at Alexandria was eventually rediscovered, not because someone found the missing scrolls, but because new generations of scholars repeated the observations, performed the experiments, reasoned through the problems again. What was destroyed in Alexandria could not ultimately be destroyed, because it existed not just on papyrus, but in the structure of reality itself, waiting to be found again by anyone curious enough to look. Still, one wonders. One stands in the empty space where the library once rose, where 700,000 scrolls once rested in cedar cases, where scholars once debated in a dozen languages, and one wonders, what was lost that we will never recover? What insights died with those scrolls? What understanding did we have to rediscover, and what have we simply forgotten? The questions no longer even occurring to us because the texts that would have prompted them are gone. The ghosts of Alexandria do not answer. The harbor is quiet now. The smoke has long since dispersed. And somewhere in the silence where memory fades, the whispers of lost knowledge continue their patient vigil, waiting for someone to remember what we once knew, waiting to be found again in the careful observations of those who still look up at the stars and wonder, still ask questions about the nature of existence, still seek to understand. Perhaps that is all any library ever does. Hold space for wonder until the next generation arrives to claim it. And perhaps what burns can never truly be destroyed, only scattered, transformed, hidden until we are ready to discover it again. The ocean's memory of sunken hulls beneath the surface, where light turns to shadow and shadow fades to darkness. Stone columns rise from sand like the ribs of a sleeping titan. They stand in formation, still rows of pillars that once held roofs above bustling streets, that once framed doorways where merchants haggled and lovers met and children played games whose rules are now forgotten. But the roofs have long since collapsed or dissolved into the currents. The doorways open onto nothing but blue emptiness. And the streets are walked now only by fish that drift between the ruins with the weightless grace of spirits navigating some aquatic afterlife. This is a drowned city, a civilization claimed by the sea so gradually that its people may not have noticed the encroaching tide at first, a king tide that didn't fully recede, a dock that seemed slightly lower than before, water pulling in the forum after storms, taking longer each year to drain away. Perhaps they built walls against the creeping ocean. Perhaps they raised the floors of their temples, adding new layers atop old foundations. Perhaps they told themselves it was temporary, that the sea would retreat as it always had, that their city would endure as it had for centuries. But the water kept rising, or the land kept sinking, or some combination of both, patient and inexorable as time itself. And one day, or perhaps over many days, many years, the city slipped beneath the waves and did not return. It is said that there are more ruins underwater than above, more lost cities resting on seabeds than standing proud on dry land. The ocean is a collector of civilizations, gathering them into its cold embrace, preserving them in ways that wind and weather never could. Where terrestrial ruins crumble under sun and frost, where walls collapse and stones are carried away for new buildings, underwater sites remain suspended in a kind of eternal stillness. The water protects them even as it claims them, keeping looters at bay, slowing the decay, holding everything in place beneath the weight of the sea. We descend now through layers of blue shadow, following the path that divers have traced into these submerged streets. The light changes as we sink deeper, first the brilliant turquoise of shallow water where sunlight still penetrates, then the deeper blue of the thermocline, then finally the dim twilight of the ocean floor where only scattered rays reach down to touch stone that has not felt full sunlight in 3,000 years. The world down here moves to a different rhythm. Everything sways in the current, the kelp that has colonized fallen walls, the sea grass that grows between paving stones. Even the water itself seems to breathe, pulling and pushing in tidal rhythm. Fish drift past like memories, their scales catching stray beams of light. An octopus makes its home in what was once an amphora, a wine jar that traveled here from some distant port, and now serves as shelter for a creature whose ancestors were not yet born when this vessel was fired in its kiln. Pavlipetri lies off the coast of southern Greece, its streets still visible from above when the water is calm and clear. It is perhaps 5,000 years old, older than the Parthenon, older than classical Athens, a Bronze Age settlement that slipped beneath the waves before Homer sang of Troy. The city plan remains intact: houses, courtyards, tombs, streets arranged in a grid that speaks of urban planning, of intentional design, of a civilization that understood organization and architecture. Walking these streets now requires fins and diving weights, requires the ability to breathe underwater and accept that the air you seek is 30 feet above, visible as a shimmering ceiling of silver light. In another part of the Mediterranean, off the coast of Egypt, Thonis Heraclean rests beneath the silt of the Nile Delta. For centuries, it was known only from ancient texts, a port city, gateway Egypt, a place where ships from across the Mediterranean came to trade for grain and papyrus and the manufactured wonders of the Nile Valley. Then it vanished from record and memory, its very existence questioned by scholars who found no trace of it on land. But it had not vanished. It had only sunk, claimed by earthquake or subsidence or the slow settling of river delta sediment, pulled down beneath the waves until it rested on the seabed, covered by meters of silt. Modern sonar found it again, revealed the outline of a major port, docks and warehouses, temples and statues, ships that sank beside the city and became part of its ruins. Divers brought up treasures, a black granite stele inscribed with hieroglyphs and Greek massive statues of pharaohs and gods, anchors and coins, and the mundane items of daily life, all preserved in the anaerobic mud protected from oxygen and decay. Off the coast of India, the ruins of Dwarka shimmer in folklore and underwater surveys both. The texts speak of a golden city, Krishna's capital, destroyed by flood in a single night. Marine archaeologists have found structural remains, walls and platforms that may be natural, may be human-made, may be some combination of geology and lost civilization. The debates continue. The ocean keeps its counsel. The stones reveal only what the current allows, what the silt chooses to release. What all these drowned cities share is a sense of suspension, not quite lost, not quite found, existing in that liminal space between memory and myth. To swim through their streets is to swim through time itself, to move between moments. The vibrant living city with its noise and commerce and the complexity of human habitation, and the silent tomb has become populated only by fish and coral and the slow accretion of marine life. Imagine these places in their living days. The morning sun warming painted columns red and blue and gold, colors that have long since faded or been scoured away by current. Merchants in the marketplace calling out prices, their voices competing in the friendly chaos of commerce. Children running between the pillars, playing games that are universal and ancient. Tag, hide and seek, races to imaginary finish lines. Priests in their robes carrying offerings to waterfront temples, perhaps pausing to watch ships entering the harbor. Sails furled as oars brought them carefully to dock. The harbors would have been the heartbeat of these cities, places where the world came to them, where news arrived with every ship, where goods from impossible distances could be touched and traded. Egyptian grain, Phoenician purple dye, Greek pottery, amber from the distant north, spices whose origins were half mythical. The waterfront would have smelled of tar and salt, of fish and exotic cargo, of humanity gathered in pursuit of profit and connection. Then came the change, perhaps an earthquake, the ground shaking, waves rushing inland, buildings cracking, people fleeing in terror. Perhaps slower, a subsidence so gradual that each generation thought the flooding a little worse than their grandparents remembered, but not catastrophic, not yet. Perhaps sea level rise following the end of the last ice age, ocean expanding as glaciers melted, coastlines retreating inland as water reclaimed land that had been dry for millennia. However it happened, the result was the same. The streets filled with water, the temples sank beneath the waves, the marketplaces became silent. The city that had been home to thousands became home to none, its population dispersed to other ports, other cities, carrying with them memories of the place they had lost, but unable to prevent its drowning. And the ocean folded them into its keeping. Modern technology reveals these cities with increasing clarity. Side-scan sonar maps the seabed, showing the outlines of buildings and streets with a precision that would have seemed magical a century ago. Underwater robots equipped with cameras glide through drowned halls, recording video that allows us to virtually walk spaces we could never physically enter. Archaeologists piece together the stories, where the wealthy lived, where goods were stored, how the city was organized, what gods they worshipped, what disasters they faced. Yet for all our technology, for all our ability to map and record and analyze, the ocean keeps its deepest secrets. Organic materials have rotted away the wooden beams that held roofs, the fabric that covered market stalls, the papyrus and parchment on which they wrote their stories. Inscriptions have been worn smooth by current and the passage of time. The voices that once filled these streets arguing and laughing, bargaining and singing, praying and gossiping have been replaced by the ocean's endless hymn. The sound of water moving over stone, of bubbles rising, of the deep silence that exists beneath the waves. To visit these drowned cities is to confront impermanence in its most poetic form. Stone endures, but stone can sink. Cities thrive, but cities can drown. Everything we build, everything we believe to be permanent and solid, rests on ground that may shift, above water that may rise. The ocean is patient. It has time. It will outlast every city ever built on its shores, and it will fold them all eventually into its cold embrace. Perhaps that is why these underwater ruins feel so haunting, so sacred in their way. They remind us that we are temporary tenants on land the sea has lent us, that the boundary between earth and ocean is not fixed but fluid, that what is solid today may be submerged tomorrow. The columns still stand in their formations, marking streets that lead nowhere now. The statues still gaze upward through shifting light, their stone eyes seeing only water where once they saw sky. And somewhere in the liquid silence, in the spaces between the ruins, the memory of what was lingers like a current you can almost feel but never quite grasp, the echo of voices, the shadow of movement, the ghost of a city that once rose proud against the horizon and now rests in perpetual twilight beneath the waves. The ocean remembers. It always remembers. It holds these cities in its depths, the way we hold dreams upon waking, present but intangible, real but unreachable, forever suspended between the world that was and the silence that remains. The script no scholar can read there is clay between your fingers, ancient, crumbling, bearing marks that once meant something. The symbols are pressed into the surface with deliberate care, each impression made when the clay was still soft, still willing to receive the message. Lines and curves, dots and crescents, shapes that feel almost familiar, as if they might resolve into letters you know if you could only look at them from the right angle, in the right light, with the proper understanding. But they do not resolve. They remain suspended in that maddening space between recognition and comprehension, like words spoken in a language you almost remember from a dream. This is Linear A, the undeciphered script of Minoan Crete, and it has guarded its secrets for 35 centuries. The tablets themselves are modest rectangles of clay no larger than a hand, their surfaces covered in neat rows of symbols impressed by scribes who died when the Bronze Age was still young. They were found in the ruins of palaces, Knossos, Phaistos, Zakros, Khania. They were discovered in storerooms and archives, in chambers that collapsed when fire swept through these great buildings around 1450 BCE. The fire that destroyed the palaces baked these tablets hard as stone, transforming administrative records into artifacts that would outlast the civilization that created them. There is poetry in that paradox: preservation through catastrophe, memory saved by the very flames that consumed everything else. When archaeologists first found these tablets, there was hope. Hope that quickly turned to fascination, then to obsession, then to the particular frustration that comes from standing before a locked door for which no key exists. Because the symbols look purposeful, systematic, clearly linguistic. They are not random marks or decorative flourishes. They were writing, true writing, conveying specific meaning, recording information that mattered enough to be preserved in clay. Someone baked these tablets knowing they contained something important: inventories of goods, religious dedications, administrative records, perhaps even stories or poetry or sacred texts. But what they say, we cannot read. It is said that there are roughly 90 distinct signs in Linear A, appearing in various combinations across the few hundred tablets that survive. Some signs look almost identical to those in Linear B, the later script used by the Mycenaean Greeks, which was successfully deciphered in the 1950s by Michael Ventris. That decipherment was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century, the moment when clay tablets that had been silent for 3 millennia suddenly spoke again, revealing themselves as economic records in an archaic form of Greek. Surely, scholars thought, Linear would follow. Surely if the scripts shared symbols, if one was clearly descended from the other, the translation would be straightforward. But it was not. It is not. The handful of signs that Linear A and Linear B share are tantalizing hints, not keys. They suggest phonetic values, possible pronunciations, but when you try to read Linear A as Greek, the words dissolve into nonsense. The Minoans were not writing Greek. They were writing something else, a language that left no descendants, no relatives, no way to triangulate meaning through comparison, and so the tablets remain opaque. Scholars have devoted lifetimes to these symbols. They have created concordances cataloging every appearance of every sign. They have analyzed symbol frequency, searching for patterns that might reveal grammatical structure. They have compared tablets from different sites, looking for regional variations or chronological changes. They have proposed theories that the language is related to Luwian or Etruscan or some pre-Indo-European tongue whose last speakers died out before history began recording such things. Every theory comes with evidence, with careful reasoning, with passionate advocacy, and every theory remains unproven, because without a bilingual text, without a Rosetta Stone bearing the same message in Linear A and some known language, there is no way to verify translation, no way to confirm that the patterns we think we see are real and not projections of our desire for meaning. The atmosphere in the archives where these tablets rest is one of reverent frustration. The knowledge that meaning exists, that these symbols once conveyed thought as clearly and precisely as the alphabet on this page, makes their opacity all the more maddening. They are not meaningless, they are sealed, locked behind time's veil, speaking in a voice we can hear but cannot understand. What did the Minoan priestesses record in these tablets? We know they existed, women depicted in frescoes wearing elaborate robes, handling sacred objects, presiding over rituals in the great palaces. Did they write prayers? Instructions for ceremonies? Records of offerings made to gods whose names we can only guess. Some tablets appear to be religious in nature, found in contexts that suggest shrine or temple. The symbols march across the clay in careful columns, each mark deliberate, preserving something that mattered enough to be written down. Perhaps they recorded the labyrinthine rituals for which Crete is famous. The very word labyrinth may derive from labris, the double-headed axe that appears as a sacred symbol throughout Minoan culture. Did the tablets contain instructions for navigating the metaphorical maze of religious observance? Step-by-step guides to ceremonies that connected the earthly realm to whatever gods or powers the Minoans believed governed their world. Or perhaps the tablets hold more mundane treasures. Inventories are sacred in their own way. They tell us what a civilization valued, what it counted, what it considered important enough to track. Linear B tablets record shipments of grain and olive oil, allocations of bronze, distributions of wool to textile workers. Surely Linear A tablets contain similar information. We can see numbers recorded alongside symbols, quantities measured out with care, but the items being counted remain mysterious. We see the number but not what it numbers. We see the allocation but not what is being distributed. The economic life of Minoan Crete remains a ghost, present but intangible. Some believe there are poems hidden in these tablets, or fragments of epic narratives, or wisdom literature of the kind that every civilization produces. The Egyptians had their instructions of Ptahhotep. The Mesopotamians had the Epic of Gilgamesh. Surely the sophisticated, artistic, trade-connected Minoans had their own literature, their own ways of encoding beauty and meaning in language. If such texts existed, if they were important enough to be written down, if by chance they were stored in clay rather than perishable materials, then they might be among the tablets we have. They might be the ones we hold in our hands, turning them carefully under museum lights, tracing the symbols with fingertips that will never know what they mean. The tablets survived because they were baked in fires that destroyed the palaces. Scholars debate what caused those fires. Earthquake? Invasion? Internal conflict? The answer remains unclear. What is clear is that around 1450 BCE, the great Minoan palaces burned. Some were rebuilt, some were not. The civilization that had flourished on Crete for centuries entered a period of transformation and eventual decline. The Mycenaean Greeks, whose Linear B script we can read, came to dominate the island. Linear A faded from use. and with it, the Minoan language itself disappeared, taking its entire way of seeing and naming the world into silence. Languages die this way, sometimes not with violence, but with the slow shift of generations. As children grow up speaking the conqueror's tongue or the trader's language, as the old words become first antiquated, then archaic, then forgotten entirely. The Minoans did not vanish as a people, but their language vanished, and with it went the key to these tablets. The last person who could read Linear A died, not knowing they were the last, not knowing that from that moment forward, these symbols would be indecipherable. We close our contemplation of these tablets in the quiet spaces, where they now rest: museum storerooms and university archives, climate-controlled chambers where they are preserved with the same care once given to holy relics. They are modest objects, unassuming rectangles of clay that could fit in the palm of your hand. Yet they bear the weight of an entire vanished tongue, an entire way of thinking and speaking and understanding the world that no longer exists anywhere except in these pressed impressions. Scholars continue their work. New tablets are occasionally discovered in excavations. New analytical techniques are applied: computational linguistics, statistical analysis, pattern recognition algorithms that might see connections human eyes miss. Each new approach brings hope. Each brings some small insight. But the fundamental barrier remains. Without a bilingual text, without some way to anchor these symbols to sounds and meanings we know, Linear may remain forever mysterious. Perhaps that is its own kind of gift. Perhaps there is value in mystery that persists, in questions that remain unanswered despite our best efforts. These tablets remind us that the past is not fully recoverable, that some knowledge is truly lost, that entire civilizations can leave traces we can touch but never fully comprehend. They are a meditation on the limits of understanding, on the fragility of language, on the way that meaning can be simultaneously present and inaccessible. The symbols remain on the clay, patient as stone. The voice of Bronze Age Crete remains a whisper we can hear, but never quite understand. A song whose melody is lost though the notation survives. And perhaps, in the end, that is enough to know that the song existed, that it mattered enough to be written down. That somewhere in these symbols rests meaning that once made perfect sense to those who wrote them and those who read them. Even if that sense is sealed to us now, locked behind time's door, waiting for a key that may never be found. The clay remembers, even if we cannot read what it remembers. And in the silence between symbols, the Minoans continue their patient witness, speaking still in a language only they understood, holding their secrets close across the centuries, eternal in their opacity. The star maps older than Egypt in the hills of southeastern Turkey, where the earth is the color of dried honey, and the wind carries the scent of wild thyme. Stones rise from the ground like prayers carved into permanence. They are not small. These pillars tower twice the height of a man, their surfaces decorated with animals rendered in relief, so precise you can almost hear the foxes breathing, the scorpions clicking, the birds taking flight into an eternal stone sky. They are arranged in circles, these megaliths, positioned with the kind of deliberate care that suggests ceremony, that implies meaning deeper than decoration. And they are impossibly old, erected 11,000 years ago, when the pyramids of Egypt were still 6 millennia in the future, when the great cities of Mesopotamia existed only as distant possibility in the minds of people who had not yet learned to plant grain. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it was not supposed to exist. Everything we thought we knew about human development said that hunter-gatherers did not build monuments. They moved with the seasons, following game and gathering what grew wild. They lived in small bands, their social organization too simple, their resources too limited, their knowledge too primitive for anything approaching architecture. Cities came first, we believed. Agriculture enabled surplus. Surplus enabled specialization. Specialization enabled civilization. And civilization, finally, enabled the construction of temples and observatories and monuments that spoke of humanity's desire to mark its presence on the landscape, to create something that would outlast the fleeting individual life. But Göbekli Tepe inverts this narrative entirely. The stones came before the cities. The temple preceded the village. And the people who carved these pillars were not farmers, but hunters not settled, but nomadic, not civilized in any sense we would have recognized, yet capable of creating something so sophisticated, so precisely executed, so rich with symbolic meaning that we are still trying to comprehend its purpose. The stones themselves seem to know something we have forgotten. They stand in their circles like witnesses to a ceremony that never ended, or perhaps like participants in a ritual frozen mid-gesture, waiting for the moment to continue. The pillars are T-shaped, carved from the living bedrock of the hill, and then transported, though by what method, with what tools, we can only guess. Some weigh 10 tons or more. All are decorated. The animals march across their surfaces in procession. Wild boar and gazelles, snakes and cranes, creatures that roamed these hills when the world was younger and colder, when the last ice age was only recently ended, and the climate had not yet settled into the rhythms we know. But it is not only animals that decorate these stones. There are symbols, geometric patterns, crescents, H-shapes, lines, and curves that feel almost alphabetic, but resist interpretation. And there are formations in the arrangement of the pillars themselves, alignments that some researchers believe encode astronomical knowledge. That may represent the night sky as it appeared when these stones were raised, when constellations occupied positions they have since rotated away from through the slow precession of Earth's axis. It is said that Göbekli Tepe might be a record written in stone, not of mundane things like trade or conquest, but of the heavens themselves, of cycles observed over generations, of celestial events important enough to be immortalized. Some believe the carvings record a comet strike, a catastrophe remembered in the myths of peoples across the world as flood, or fire, or the day the sky fell. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that around 10,800 BC, fragments of a disintegrating comet struck Earth, triggering climate chaos, extinctions, and floods. The dating is close to Göbekli Tepe's construction. Could the stones be a memorial, a warning, a way of encoding the knowledge that the sky is not always benign, that the stars can reach down with terrible violence? Others see in the arrangements a map-specific constellations rendered not in their modern positions, but as they appeared 11,000 years ago, before precession shifted them. The pillar with the vulture, the scorpion, the circle, could these be Sagittarius, Scorpius, the sun? Is this depicting a particular moment, a specific alignment significant enough to be carved in stone for people who would not be born for thousands of years? The emotional weight of standing before these stones is a kind of temporal vertigo. We are accustomed to thinking of our ancestors from this period as primitive, their concerns limited to survival, their intellectual life undeveloped. But here is evidence of abstract thought, of long-term planning, of the ability to organize labor on a scale that required social structures we assumed did not yet exist. Here is art of stunning sophistication. Here is symbolic representation, geometric precision, architectural ambition that speaks of minds as complex and capable as our own, simply operating in a different context, with different tools, solving different problems. The tone here must remain hushed, reverent, as if we have stumbled into a temple that is still holding ceremony in its bones, still vibrating with the intention that raised it from the earth. This is not a ruin in the ordinary sense. It is not broken or decayed. It was deliberately buried, filled in with soil and rubble around 8000 BC, covered, completely hidden from view, as if its purpose had been fulfilled or its presence had become too sacred to remain exposed to the open sky. Why would they bury it? Why take such care to inter these massive stones, to fill the circles with earth, to transform a living ceremonial center into a time capsule? Perhaps the stones had served their purpose. Perhaps the astronomical alignment they marked had passed, the cycle completed, the warning delivered. Perhaps the people who used this place understood that sacredness has seasons, that what is holy at one time may need to rest at another, sleeping beneath the earth until the world is ready to remember. Or perhaps it grew too powerful, too dangerous, too intimately connected with forces that needed to be sealed away. In many cultures, sacred spaces can become so charged with spiritual significance that they must be abandoned, left to the gods or spirits who dwell there, no longer safe for human contact. The careful burial, not destruction, But preservation suggests this kind of reverence, as if the builders were not rejecting what they had made, but acknowledging that it belonged now to something beyond themselves. The intentional interment is what saved Göbekli Tepe. While other Neolithic sites eroded under millennia of weather, while stones were toppled and scattered and repurposed by later peoples, Göbekli Tepe slept beneath its earthen blanket, protected from wind and rain and human interference. When archaeologists first identified the site in the 1990s and began excavation, they uncovered something that had been waiting, preserved almost perfectly, for 8,000 years. We explore now the sanctuary's possible purposes, walking between pillars in imagination, if not in body. Was this a pilgrimage site, a place where scattered bands of hunter-gatherers journeyed at specific times of year, gathering in numbers that would be impossible to sustain year-round, conducting rituals beneath the stars their stones immortalized? The location supports this theory. The hill commands views across the surrounding plain. No evidence of permanent habitation has been found, no trash heaps, no graves, no signs of daily life. Only the ceremonial structures, repeated in circles across the hilltop, each one carefully built and then, eventually, filled in before the next was begun. Or was it an astronomical observatory, a place where sky watchers gathered to track the movements of sun and moon and planets, recording their observations in stone, because they had not yet developed writing? The alignments suggest this. Certain stones mark solstice sunrises, lunar standstills, the rising points of significant stars. The level of precision required to create these alignments speaks of careful observation over many seasons, perhaps many lifetimes, knowledge accumulated and passed down through oral tradition till it could be encoded permanently in architecture. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps for the people who built Göbekli Tepe, there was no distinction between astronomy and religion, between observation and worship. The sky was where the gods dwelt, or where they revealed themselves, or where the patterns of existence could be read by those trained to interpret them. To track the stars was to perform a sacred act. To gather beneath them in ritual was to align oneself with cosmic order. The chapter must close in wondering silence, not with answers, but with the deeper satisfaction of good questions asked in the presence of mystery. We contemplate the possibility that astronomy, careful, systematic observation of celestial cycles, might be older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than permanent settlements. That humans looked up before they looked down, that we tracked the stars before we planted seeds, that our first monuments were not to kings or gods, but to the patterns we saw wheeling overhead in the darkness. The stars these ancient people carved are still above us. Their patterns have shifted, precession has rotated the constellations slowly over 11,000 years, moving them through their vast cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete. But their light still reaches down. The same photons that illuminated the ceremonies at Göbekli Tepe now falling on the stones archaeologists have re-exposed to the sky. And the stones remain, should not exist but do, testament to a sophistication we did not expect, a knowledge we had not imagined, a devotion to the heavens that transcended the supposedly simple concerns of survival and hunting and the daily search for food. Perhaps they understood something we have forgotten, that to watch the sky is to remember we are part of something larger, that the patterns overhead connect us to all who came before and all who will come after, that some knowledge is worth carving in stone, even if the reason why will be lost to those who find it millennia hence. The wind moves across the Turkish hills, carrying the scent of wild thyme. The stones stand in their ancient circles, patient as stars. And somewhere in the space between earth and sky, between past and present, the ceremony continues, held in stone, waiting to be remembered. The kingdom written only in myth. There was once a city that existed only in poetry. It lived in hexameter verse, in the rhythm of dactyls that carried stories across centuries before they were ever written down. It lived in the voice of Homer, or whoever Homer was. Whatever collected consciousness gave us the Iliad, singing of bronze-armed warriors and black-hulled ships, of a siege that lasted 10 years, of a war sparked by beauty and pride, and the inscrutable will of gods who moved among mortals like players arranging pieces on a board. Troy was its name, and for millennia, it was considered no more real than Olympus, no more historical than the Cyclops or the Sirens or any of the other wonders that populated Greek mythology. It was a dream dressed in epic language, a metaphor for something: conflict, glory, the price of honor, the inevitability of fate. But not a place you could visit, not ruins you could walk through, not stones you could touch with your hands and know that yes, this happened here, in this specific location, in actual time. Until one man believed the poetry enough to start digging. The opening image is deceptive in its simplicity: a mound in northwestern Turkey rising from the plain near the Dardanelles, covered in scrub grass and wildflowers, marked on no maps as significant, ignored by scholars who knew that myth was myth and history was something altogether different. But Heinrich Schliemann, wealthy, obsessed, armed with copies of Homer and an unshakable conviction that the Iliad contained geographical truth, came to this mound at Hissarlik in 1870 and began to excavate. His spade struck stone, and the stone was a wall, and the wall was part of a city, and the city had burned. The emotional arc of this discovery moves from skepticism to vindication to complication, each phase deepening our understanding while simultaneously making certainty more elusive. Because Schliemann did not find one Troy. He found 9 cities layered atop each other like pages in a palimpsest, each one built, inhabited, destroyed, and then rebuilt by new people who chose the same strategic hilltop for their settlement. 9 Troys, stacked through time, each leaving its archaeological signature in pottery and walls, and the detritus of daily life. Which one was Homer's? Schliemann believed it was Troy too, a layer rich with gold and treasure, artifacts of a wealthy Bronze Age city. He called one spectacular find Priam's treasure, imagining these golden diadems and vessels as the possessions of Troy's legendary king. But later archaeology proved him wrong. Troy too dated to around 2500 BCE, 1,000 years too early for the Trojan War, as tradition placed it. The treasure was real, the city was real, but it was not the Troy of Achilles and Hector. The Troy that matches Homer's timeline is Troy Via, a layer showing evidence of catastrophic destruction around 1180 BCE. The dating is right, the late Bronze Age, the period when Mycenaean Greece was at its height, when the great palaces at Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos were still functioning, when the Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia and trade routes across the region were valuable enough to fight over. Troy Via burned. The evidence of fire is clear in the archaeological record, and the city's strategic location controlling access to the Dardanelles. The narrow strait connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea would have made it valuable enough to siege, to covet, to destroy if it could not be controlled. But here is where vindication meets complication. Troy Via is modest. Its walls are strong, but not spectacular. Its houses are small, cramped, built hastily as if under threat. This is not the gleaming citadel of Homer's verse, not the city of wide streets and great towers, not the place wealthy enough to provoke 1,000 ships to launch in pursuit of justice and honor and a stolen queen. Yet it existed. Stone testifies to that much. We walk these walls now in imagination, tracing the circuit of fortifications that still stand in places, still bear witness to their builders' engineering skill. The walls are thick, built of precisely fitted stones, angled to deflect siege weapons. They enclose a hilltop that commands views across the plain to the sea, a position of obvious military significance. Anyone controlling this height-controlled movement through the straits could exact tolls from ships, could grow wealthy on trade or conquest, or both. Did a war happen here? Almost certainly. Cities in this period fought constantly over resources, territory, trade routes, insults real or imagined. Did it last 10 years? Unlikely in the literal sense, but siege warfare in the Bronze Age could be protracted, punctuated by truces and negotiations, fighting that stopped and started over seasons or years. Did it involve the heroes Homer names? We will never know. Achilles and Hector, Priam and Paris, Helen herself. These may be inventions, or composites, or actual individuals whose stories were transformed by oral tradition until the person became archetype, the specific became universal. The wooden horse presents its own mystery. In Homer's telling, it is literal, a massive hollow horse filled with Greek warriors, a trick that allowed the invaders to finally penetrate Troy's defenses after a decade of failed assaults. But some scholars propose alternative readings. The horse as metaphor for a siege engine, a battering ram with a horse head decoration, or even for earthquake, since Poseidon, god of horses and of seismic activity, was said to be Troy's destroyer. The Greeks had a tradition of attributing earthquake damage to divine intervention, and a major earthquake could have weakened Troy's walls, allowing attackers to finally breach defenses that had held for years. Perhaps the truth is that something happened, a war, a siege, a destruction significant enough to lodge in cultural memory, and that event was transmitted through oral tradition, shaped and reshaped by generations of bards who added divine machinery, expanded timelines, gave names and speeches and interior lives to warriors who may have been anonymous soldiers fighting for reasons far more mundane than Homer's tale of love and honor suggests. Trade routes are not as poetic as Helen's face. Access to Black Sea grain is not as compelling as the rage of Achilles. But wars are fought over such things, and the people who die in them bleed just as red, whether the cause is economics or epic. The atmosphere throughout must remain dreamlike, suspended between history and story. Because the truth is that we cannot fully separate them. The archaeology proves a city existed, proves it burned at approximately the right time. But it cannot prove the war happened as Homer describes, cannot confirm that any specific individual walked these streets, cannot tell us whether the destruction was coordinated assault, civil uprising, earthquake, or some combination of factors that left the city vulnerable to final catastrophe. What remains is poetry and stone, each testifying to something real, but neither offering complete truth. The poetry gives us emotional accuracy, the terror and glory of war, the bonds between warriors, the grief of those left behind. The stone gives us physical verification. Yes, there was a city. Yes, it burned. Yes, it mattered enough that new inhabitants kept rebuilding on the same spot despite repeated destruction. Perhaps that is all we can ask of the past, not perfect knowledge but fragments that gesture toward truth, evidence that confirms some core of reality within the elaborated myth. It is said that Schliemann's discovery opened possibilities for other legendary places. If Troy was real, what else might be? Atlantis, the island civilization Plato described, and that sank beneath the waves, might it be waiting beneath Mediterranean or Atlantic waters, its ruins preserved in sand and silt? Shangri-La, the hidden valley of eternal youth, might it correspond to some actual isolated settlement in the Himalayas, a place where geography and legend merged? El Dorado, the city of gold that lured conquistadors to their deaths, was there an actual wealthy kingdom at the story's origin, real enough to inspire the myth, even if the streets were never paved with precious metal? Troy teaches us that myth sometimes remembers what history forgets, that oral tradition can preserve kernels of truth across millennia, even as it transforms them into story. The siege may not have involved gods walking among mortals, but something terrible and magnificent enough to echo through 3,000 years of retelling clearly occurred. That much the stones confirm. We close in contemplative silence, standing before walls that have witnessed more history than most places on earth: Bronze Age kingdoms rising and falling, Greek colonies, Roman cities, Byzantine fortresses, Ottoman settlements. The hill at Hisarlik has been continuously significant for over 5,000 years, each civilization recognizing what earlier inhabitants knew. This location matters. This height commands. This place is worth building upon even when previous cities have burned. Somewhere in those layers rests Homer's Troy, perhaps Troy via, perhaps some combination of multiple destructions remembered as one, perhaps a truth so transformed by oral tradition that we can recognize only its shadow, its echo, its poetic residue. The stones remain, witness to something that happened in the Bronze Age twilight. The poetry remains, carrying that something forward through time, giving it meaning that transcends archaeological verification. And perhaps that is the real lesson, that truth can arrive wrapped in story, that fact and myth need not be enemies but can be partners in preservation, that sometimes the most accurate way to remember is through the transforming lens of poetry that makes the specific universal, the historical eternal, the local cosmic. Troy was legend. Troy was real. Both statements are true, and in their paradox lies wisdom worth carrying into sleep. The silence where voices were erased. There is a river running black with ink. It flows through Baghdad in the year 1258, carrying with it something more precious than the waters that usually sustain this ancient city. The Tigris has become a conduit for lost knowledge, manuscripts and scrolls, and bound volumes thrown from the windows of the House of Wisdom by Mongol invaders, who understand perhaps better than most conquerors that to control a people, you must first control their memory. The river accepts its dark cargo, pages dissolving into pulp, ink bleeding into current, a millennium of learning dispersed into the water that flows toward the Persian Gulf, and eventually the sea. This is not lost through accident or neglect. This is erasure, deliberate and systematic. The House of Wisdom had been a beacon for centuries, a place where scholars from across the Islamic world gathered to translate, to study, to expand the boundaries of human understanding. Here, Greek philosophy was preserved and commented upon, saving works that had been lost in Europe. Here, Persian astronomy was refined and expanded, producing star charts of unprecedented accuracy. Here, Indian mathematics, including the revolutionary concept of zero, was integrated with Greek geometry and Arab innovation, creating the foundations of algebra and algorithms that would eventually transform human capacity for calculation and abstract thought. All of this thrown into the river. All of this reduced to dark stains and moving water. Legend says you could walk across the Tigris on a bridge made of books. Legend says the river ran black with ink for 6 months. Whether these details are literally true matters less than what they represent: the scale of destruction, the magnitude of loss, the systematic attempt to erase an entire intellectual tradition. But the House of Wisdom is not alone in its fate. History is haunted by burning libraries, by moments when conquerors looked at the accumulated knowledge of the conquered and saw not treasure to preserve, but threat to eliminate. In the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors encountered the Maya, a civilization with sophisticated writing, complex calendars, astronomical observations recorded in books made from bark paper, folded like screens, covered in glyphs that captured language, mathematics, history, and ritual. To European eyes, these codices seemed demonic, heretical, the work of a people who needed saving from their own culture. And so the books burned. Diego de Landa, the Franciscan friar who oversaw much of this destruction, later wrote with pride about the burning, noting how many idolatrous books he had committed to flame. In a bitter irony, de Landa later authored the most complete European account of Mayan culture, trying to record what he had helped destroy, recognizing too late that he had participated in erasing knowledge that could never be recovered. Of the thousands of Mayan codices that once existed, only 4 survive complete. 4 books to represent the literary output of a civilization that flourished for millennia, that developed a writing system capable of expressing abstract concepts, that recorded astronomical cycles with precision that rivals modern observation. The rest exists only as fragments, as echoes in Spanish chronicles, as memories in oral traditions that struggled to preserve what writing once held. The emotional weight of this loss is almost unbearable if we allow ourselves to feel its full measure. Each codex represented countless hours of scribal labor, the careful preparation of bark paper, the precise application of pigments, the encoding of knowledge in glyphs that took years to master. Each contained information we can now only guess at: complete king lists, ritual instructions, astronomical tables, mythological cycles, practical knowledge about agriculture and architecture, and the management of complex societies. Gone, reduced to ash because the conquerors could not read what was written and assumed that illegibility meant evil. In India, the great university at Nalanda stood for centuries as a center of Buddhist learning. At its height, it housed thousands of monks and students, its libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Scholars came from across Asia to study here, from Tibet, China, Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, drawn by the university's reputation, its comprehensive curriculum, its tradition of rigorous debate and careful textual analysis. In 1193, the army of Bakhtiar Khilji sacked Nalanda. The monks were killed, The libraries were set ablaze. The text's irreplaceable manuscripts representing centuries of Buddhist philosophical development, commentaries and sub-commentaries, medical treatises, and astronomical observations burned for months, legend says. The smoke could be seen for days, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of generations. What was lost at Nalanda? We know only from references in texts that survived elsewhere, from the accounts of Chinese pilgrims who visited before the destruction, from the gaps in our understanding of Buddhist intellectual history that suggest entire schools of thought whose texts no longer exist. The absence is a kind of presence. We can feel the shape of what's missing, like running your hand over a carving from which key figures have been deliberately chiseled away. The tone here must remain elegiac but not despairing, acknowledging destruction while refusing to grant it final victory. Because even as we catalog loss, we must honor what survived through determined preservation, through acts of courage that risked everything to protect knowledge. When Rome fell and Europe descended into the chaos that later historians would call the Dark Ages, learning survived in monasteries, particularly in Ireland, where monks in cold stone cells copied classical texts, preserving Virgil, and Cicero maintaining the study of Latin and Greek when such knowledge was vanishing from the continent. They worked by candlelight, their fingers cramped from cold, copying manuscripts that no one in their immediate world valued, maintaining traditions they hoped would matter again someday. They were right. When learning returned to Europe, when the Carolingian Renaissance sparked interest in classical knowledge, the texts survived because Irish monks had refused to let them die. In Alexandria, as that great library faced its slow dissolution through fire and budget cuts and changing political priorities, scholars recognized what was being lost. Some texts were smuggled out, copied and carried to other cities, preserved in private collections or smaller libraries that might escape the attention of conquerors and vandals. The tradition of textual preservation became its own form of resistance, a quiet insistence that knowledge matters, that memory cannot be allowed to die simply because those in power find it inconvenient or threatening. Jewish communities, scattered by diaspora and persecution, maintained Torah scrolls through centuries when doing so meant risking death. In times of pogrom and exile, when everything else was abandoned, the scrolls were carried forward, hidden in carts and basements, copied in secret when originals were seized or destroyed. The tradition demanded that each word be rendered perfectly, that every letter be formed with precision, that the text be preserved exactly as it had been received. This was not mere religious observance, it was an act of cultural survival, an insistence that identity and knowledge persisted even when homeland and safety did not. We explore now the psychology of erasure, trying to understand why victors burn the conquered's books, why knowledge becomes threatening enough to destroy. The answer is both simple and profound. To control a people, you must control their story. To reshape their present, you must erase their past. Books are memory in physical form. They contain alternative narratives, different ways of understanding the world, evidence that things were once different and might be different again. A library represents the possibility of resistance through remembrance. To burn a library is to burn the threads that connect people to their ancestors, to eliminate the evidence that their civilization achieved great things, to create a blank slate upon which the conqueror can write whatever history serves their purposes. It is an act of violence against time itself, an attempt to sever the connection between past and future, to make the conquered people perpetual children, with no inheritance of wisdom, no reservoir of pride, no foundation upon which to build resistance. But knowledge resists erasure with the persistence that borders on miraculous. It wants to survive, or perhaps more accurately, humans want it to survive, and will risk everything to ensure it does. Even when 90% is destroyed, the surviving 10% carries forward the light. Texts thought lost for centuries reappear in unexpected places. A monastery basement reveals manuscripts that had been considered destroyed. Desert caves yield scrolls hidden during some ancient emergency and never retrieved. Private collections pass through generations, their true contents unknown even to their owners, until some curious descendant looks more carefully at that old trunk in the attic and discovers treasure. The voice of the past insists on being heard, persistent as water finding cracks in stone. You can burn the books, but if even one copy survives somewhere, the knowledge lives. You can kill the scholars, but if they taught students who taught students, the tradition continues. You can suppress the language, but if it's spoken in homes and whispered in secret, it waits for the moment when it can emerge again into open air. This is not to minimize the tragedy of loss. What was destroyed at Baghdad and Nalanda and in the Mayan codices represents knowledge we can never fully recover, perspectives we can never fully reclaim, wisdom that might have changed our path had it survived. The world is diminished by these erasures, our collective understanding impoverished by the systematic destruction of alternative ways of knowing. But we honor the loss best by acknowledging what survived, by celebrating the courage of those who preserved fragments when complete preservation was impossible, by recognizing that even in the face of systematic destruction, knowledge finds a way to persist. The chapter closes in quiet defiance, standing in the space between loss and survival. The House of Wisdom burned, but many of its texts had already been copied and distributed to other libraries across the Islamic world. The Mayan codices were destroyed, but the astronomical knowledge they contained survived in oral tradition, in the practices of descendants who maintained the calendar cycles even without written records. Nalanda burned, but its graduates had already spread Buddhist learning across Asia, carrying texts and teachings to places the invaders never reached. Somewhere in the silence where voices were erased, echoes remain. Somewhere in the ashes, fragments wait to be found. And somewhere in the persistence of humans who refuse to forget, who copy and hide and preserve and pass forward, knowledge survives its would-be executioners. The river runs clear again now, carrying only water, but beneath the surface, in the sediment that lines its bed, traces of that ancient ink remain faint, dispersed, but present still. Memory insists, truth endures, and light, once kindled, refuses to be extinguished completely. Even in the deepest darkness, some small flame persists, tended by those who believe that what we know matters, that what we remember shapes us, that the voices of the past deserve to be heard even when others have tried to silence them forever. The books may burn, but the knowledge they contain lives on in those who refuse to forget. And that, perhaps, is the real victory, not in preventing destruction, but in ensuring that destruction is never final, never complete, never the last word on what was known and loved and worth preserving. The machine that should not exist there is bronze resting on the ocean floor, corroded beyond recognition, fused into a single unreadable mass by 2,000 years of salt water and time. It lies among the wreckage of a Roman ship that went down off the coast of Antikythera, a small Greek island, sometime around 60 BC. The ship carried treasures, marble statues, amphorae of wine, glass vessels, jewelry, the cargo of a merchant, or perhaps the spoils of conquest being transported from the eastern Mediterranean toward Rome. When the ship sank, everything went down with it: the crew, the cargo, the bronze lump that seemed, at first discovery in 1901, to be nothing more than another corroded artifact, interesting perhaps to specialists but unremarkable to the casual eye. But this was no ordinary artifact. This was something that should not exist. When researchers finally cleaned the corrosion, when X-rays revealed what lay hidden beneath the patina of centuries, what emerged was impossible according to every timeline we had constructed for technological development. Gears, dozens of them, precisely cut, interlocking in configurations that suggested not decoration but function, not art but engineering. This was a machine complex, sophisticated, designed for calculation with a level of mechanical precision we did not think ancient craftsmen could achieve. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be called, is an astronomical calculator built around 100 BCE, and it is more advanced than anything else we have from antiquity, more complex than any device we know of for the next 14 centuries. Until medieval cathedral clocks began incorporating similar gearwork to track time and display astronomical information. How is this possible? The opening emotion is disbelief, the kind that comes from encountering evidence that contradicts everything you thought you understood. We have told ourselves a particular story about technological progress, that it moves in one direction, from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated. That ancient peoples, lacking modern tools and scientific understanding, could not achieve precision engineering. That mechanical devices of any real complexity are products of the later medieval period at earliest, building toward the clockwork marvels of the Renaissance and the industrial machinery of modernity. The Antikythera mechanism shatters this narrative, not gently, not with polite suggestion, but with the blunt force of bronze gears that cannot be explained away. We explore now what this device could do. It is no larger than a showbox, encased in wood that has long since rotted away, leaving only the bronze mechanism. On its faces were dials, now fragmentary, that displayed astronomical information. You would input a date using a crank on the side, and the gears would turn, calculating the positions of celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy. The mechanism tracked the sun's position through the zodiac. It tracked the moon's phases, accounting for the irregular nature of lunar orbit, something that requires sophisticated mathematical understanding to model mechanically. It predicted eclipses using the Saros cycle, a 2-3-month pattern that Babylonian astronomers had discovered and Greek natural philosophers had refined. The device displayed a 19-year calendar, incorporating the Metonic cycle that reconciles solar years with lunar months. Some researchers believe it also showed the timing of the Olympic Games and other major athletic festivals held throughout the Greek world using a 4-year cycle that would have been important to merchants planning travel or athletes preparing for competition. All of this encoded in bronze gears, cut with such precision that they meshed smoothly, that they could turn without jamming, that they could maintain accuracy through countless calculations. The gear teeth are triangular, carefully shaped, clearly made by someone who understood not just metalworking, but the mathematics of gear ratios, who could calculate how many teeth each gear needed to represent astronomical cycles, who could translate abstract numbers into physical mechanisms. The emotional journey deepens into profound questions about what we have lost. Because the Antikythera mechanism is unique, we have no other examples. We have no workshop manuals explaining how to build such devices. We have no clear references in surviving texts to mechanisms of this complexity, though there are tantalizing hints. Cicero mentions that Archimedes built a sphere showing planetary motions, and that a similar device was created by Posidonius. But these descriptions are vague, insufficient to confirm they were describing anything like the complexity we see in the Antikythera gears. If one mechanism survived and survived only by accident of shipwreck, preserved in ocean conditions that prevented complete disintegration, how many were lost? How many were melted down for their bronze when times grew hard? How many were discarded when their workings became mysterious, when the knowledge to repair them was forgotten? How many simply corroded away in less protective environments, leaving no trace that they ever existed? The tone must remain meditative here, contemplative rather than dramatic. We imagine the device in use, perhaps aboard the very ship that carried it to its watery grave. A merchant or scholar consulting it, turning the crank to calculate when the next eclipse would occur, planning voyages around astronomical events, using it as a tool both practical and prestigious. The mechanism would have been valuable. The bronze alone represented significant wealth, and the craftsmanship, the knowledge it embodied, would have been worth far more than the storm. The ship breaking apart, everything sinking into darkness, including this machine that represented the pinnacle of ancient technological achievement. It rested on the seafloor for 2 millennia, unknown, its bronze gears frozen in salt and sediment, waiting for divers who would not recognize what they had found until decades after its recovery. We consider now the workshops where such mechanisms were created. Somewhere in the Hellenistic world, perhaps Rhodes, perhaps Corinth, perhaps some other center of learning and craftsmanship, there existed specialists who could design and build precision instruments. They must have had tools for cutting gears accurately, methods for calculating the ratios needed to model celestial motions, training systems for passing this knowledge to apprentices. An entire tradition of gear cutting and astronomical calculation existed, sophisticated enough to produce the Antikythera mechanism. And then it vanished, or seems to have vanished, leaving almost no archaeological trace. We have no gear cutting tools from this period clearly designed for precision work. We have no training text explaining the mathematics involved. We have only the mechanism itself. Silent testimony to knowledge that once existed but somehow failed to be transmitted forward. Perhaps the tradition was always small, limited to a few workshops, vulnerable to disruption. Perhaps the knowledge was considered proprietary, kept secret within families or guilds, and when key practitioners died without properly trained successors, the expertise died with them. Perhaps the mechanisms were so expensive that only a handful were ever made, and economic changes, war, political instability, shifting trade patterns eliminated the market before the technology could become widespread. Or perhaps, and this is the most haunting possibility, such mechanisms were once common, and we simply have not found the evidence yet. Perhaps they were recycled so thoroughly that only one survived by accident. Perhaps we have been looking in the wrong places, or lacking the tools to recognize corroded lumps of bronze as once functional machinery. The mechanism suggests we have underestimated ancient technical capability, that our narrative of progress is incomplete. We know the Greeks and Romans could build aqueducts and amphitheaters, could create bronze statues of stunning realism, could navigate across open seas. But we have assumed their mechanical sophistication was limited, that precise gearwork was beyond them. The Antikythera mechanism proves this assumption wrong. What else have we underestimated? What other capabilities did ancient craftsmen possess that have left insufficient evidence in the archaeological record? Building techniques, metallurgical processes, engineering principles. How much practical knowledge was encoded in workshop traditions that never got written down, that depended on apprenticeship and hands-on training, that vanished when the workshops closed? The chapter closes in wondering, not with answers, but with the deeper satisfaction of profound questions. The Antikythera mechanism sits now in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, displayed behind glass, its fragmentary gears no longer able to turn, but still capable of inspiring awe. Researchers continue to study it, using ever more sophisticated imaging techniques to reveal details hidden in corrosion. With each technological advance in our ability to examine the device, new gears are discovered, new functions revealed, new evidence of the mechanism's sophistication emerges. It is still teaching us, still challenging our assumptions, still whispering secrets about a past more complex than we imagine. The bronze is patient. It has waited 2,000 years already. It can wait longer still, until we develop the tools and understanding to fully appreciate what it represents, not just a clever mechanism, but evidence of a tradition of technical excellence that flourished and then faded, leaving only this single surviving example to prove it existed at all. Perhaps there are other mechanisms waiting to be found. Perhaps in some undiscovered shipwreck, in some unexcavated workshop, similar devices rest, their gears frozen but still present, still capable of revealing what ancient craftsmen knew. Or perhaps the Antikythera mechanism will remain unique, the sole survivor of a technological tradition that almost entirely vanished, a bronze whisper from a more sophisticated past than our timelines usually allow. Either way, it stands as reminder, the past is not simple, progress is not linear, and humans have been clever, ambitious, capable of remarkable achievement for longer than we often remember. The gears are silent now, unable to turn after so long beneath the sea. But in their frozen configurations, in the precision of their cutting, in the sophistication of their design, they still speak. They tell us we have much to learn about what was known and then forgotten. They invite us to wonder what else lies waiting, corroded and unrecognized, holding secrets about capabilities we have not yet credited to our ancestors. The machine sits in its case, patient as stone, mysterious as stars, and somewhere in the space between what we know and what we've lost, other devices may wait in darkness, mechanical memories of knowledge that should not have existed, but did. That may exist still if we know where to look, if we learn to recognize bronze whispers when we find them. The city swallowed by sand, there is a passage through stone where the sky becomes a ribbon of blue overhead. The sick, they call it a natural canyon carved by ancient waters, its walls rising sheer and close on either side, so narrow in places that you could stretch your arms and touch both faces of rock simultaneously. The stone is layered in bands of color, cream and rust, rose and amber, the strata of geological time compressed into vertical walls that lean inward as if listening to the footsteps of those who pass between them. Once, camel caravans wound through this passage, their bells echoing off stone, merchants guiding precious cargo toward the hidden city that lay beyond. Once, the sound of hoofbeats and human voices filled this corridor, a procession of commerce and pilgrimage moving through the rock as if entering a temple, which, in a sense, they were. And then the passage opens, the walls pull back, and there, carved directly from the living cliff face, rose-red and impossibly delicate, stands the treasury al-Khazna in Arabic, a temple front of such architectural sophistication that it seems to defy the medium from which it emerges. This is not a building. This is sculpture on an impossible scale, as if someone took the entire mountain and convinced it to dream of columns and pediments of statues and niches and elaborate cornices, all rendered in stone that blushes pink in the morning light and burns like ember at sunset. This is Petra, and it appears like a mirage, real but somehow impossible, solid yet dreamlike, emerging from desert emptiness as if architecture itself could be conjured from wishes and wind. The emotional arc of this place is one of rediscovery, of finding what was lost and recognizing what that finding means. For centuries after the Nabatean kingdom's decline, Petra existed only in rumor and local knowledge. The Bedouin tribes who made the desert their home knew of the ruins, passed among the facades, perhaps sheltered in the carved spaces during sandstorms. But to the wider world, to European scholars and adventurers who collected tales of ancient wonders, Petra was legend. A lost city, a place that had once existed but could no longer be found, swallowed by the desert that had given it birth. Travelers heard whispers, an abandoned city carved from rose-red cliffs, temples and tombs cut directly into the rock. A place where the Nabateans had built their capital, controlling trade routes between Arabia and the Mediterranean, growing wealthy on frankincense and myrrh, on silken spices that passed through their hands on the way from distant east to the markets of Rome. But where? The desert keeps its secrets well. Sand covers tracks, wind erases memory, landmarks shift and change. And so Petra remained hidden, known but not known, remembered but not found. Until Johann Ludwig Burckhardt arrived in 1812, traveling in disguise as an Arab merchant, his features darkened by sun, his Arabic fluent enough to pass inspection by those who might be suspicious of European curiosity. He had heard the rumors, he had studied the ancient texts that mentioned a great city in the desert, and he convinced a local guide to lead him through the sick, offering the excuse that he wished to make a sacrifice at the tomb of Aaron, which local tradition placed somewhere in these mountains. The guide led him through the narrow passage, and when the walls opened, when the treasury appeared in all its carved magnificence, Burckhardt knew he had found what the world had lost. He could not linger to show too much interest, would reveal his true identity, would suggest he was not the merchant he claimed to be. So he walked through quickly, noting what he could, committing to memory the impossible facades, the streets lined with empty tombs, the theaters carved into hillsides, the temples standing open to desert sky. Later, when he returned to Europe and published his account, the world could scarcely believe him. A city carved from living rock, facades that rivaled classical architecture, executed not in blocks laid atop each other, but in stone that had never been separate from the earth. It seemed too fantastical, too much like the tales of Sinbad and the Arabian Nights to be actual geography. But it was real. The ruins remained, waiting in the desert, as they had waited for centuries, as they wait still. The atmosphere of Petra is both triumphant and melancholy. Triumph at the finding, at the recovery of something lost to memory, at the confirmation that the Nabateans had indeed built something magnificent, had created architecture that could stand comparison with anything in the classical world. But melancholy too, because what was found was empty. The city that had thrived here, that had grown wealthy on trade and water management, that had carved these elaborate facades to honor their dead and impress their visitors, that city was gone. Only the stone remained, and stone cannot tell us what it felt like to live here, to walk these streets when they were busy with commerce, to hear the languages spoken by traders from a dozen different regions, to smell the incense and spices that made the Nabateans rich. We explore now the genius that allowed this city to exist at all. Petra sits in a desert where rainfall is scarce and unpredictable. No great river flows here. No permanent springs offer endless water. By all logic, this should be a place of temporary camps, not permanent settlement. Certainly not a thriving city that could support thousands of inhabitants and host caravans from across the known world. But the Nabateans understood water. They carved channels into the rock face to catch the brief, violent flash floods that occasionally roared through desert wadis. They built dams to slow the water, cisterns to store it, terracotta pipes to distribute it throughout the city. They terraced the hillsides to maximize rainwater collection. They created a hydraulic system so sophisticated that it could sustain urban life in conditions where survival alone should have been challenging. This mastery of water was the foundation of their prosperity. Control water in the desert, and you control life itself. You can support a permanent population. You can provision caravans. You can create gardens in wilderness, grow food where none should grow, build a city where only nomads should pass through. And they grew wealthy as middlemen, positioned perfectly along trade routes that connected Arabia's incense-producing regions with the Mediterranean world's insatiable demand for exotic goods. Frankincense and myrrh, precious resins burned in temples and homes, worth their weight in gold. Silk from China, spices from India, all passing through Nabatean hands, all enriching the merchants who controlled these routes. Petra's facades reflect that wealth. The treasury alone carved for reasons scholars still debate. Perhaps a royal tomb, perhaps a temple represents an enormous investment of labor and resources. Teams of craftsmen working for years, carving from the top down, following designs that required sophisticated understanding of classical architectural principles. The result is architecture that looks like it should be built of marble blocks, but is instead solid stone, part of the mountain itself, as if permanence could be achieved through integration rather than construction. But permanence is always an illusion, especially in the desert, where time moves differently, where what thrives today may be buried tomorrow beneath advancing dunes. Rome came, as Rome always came, expanding its empire, annexing kingdoms, redirecting resources toward its own purposes. The Nabatean kingdom was absorbed peacefully in 106 CE, becoming the Roman province of Arabia Petrea. At first, little changed. Petra remained important, the trade routes continued, wealth still flowed through the city carved from stone. But gradually, inevitably, Rome shifted trade to sea routes. Merchant ships could carry more cargo than camel caravans, could move faster, could bypass the middlemen who had grown rich on land-based trade. The routes through Petra became less important, less traveled. The wealth that had sustained the city began to dry up, as surely as water evaporating from a desert cistern, and Petra began to fade. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, over generations, as people moved away, as buildings fell into disrepair, as the elaborate water system requiring constant maintenance began to fail. Earthquakes struck, damaging structures, making some areas unsafe. The population dwindled. Eventually, only the Bedouin remained, living among the ruins of a grandeur they had not built, passing between facades carved for purposes they no longer fully understood. The desert reclaimed what had always been its domain. Sand drifted through empty streets. Wind eroded the carved details. Flash floods, no longer controlled by Nabatean engineering, damaged what earthquakes had weakened. The city that had been carved to last eternally was inhabited in its prime for less than 5 centuries, a blink in geological time, barely a breath in the life of the mountains from which it was carved. The chapter deepens now into themes of impermanence, of the illusion of permanence that stone creates. Petra was meant to endure. The Nabateans chose to carve rather than build precisely because carved facades cannot be dismantled, cannot be carried away by conquerors seeking building materials. The rock itself was the monument, and rock endures when wood rots and brick crumbles. Yet the city still faded, not because the stone disappeared. The facades remain, weathered but recognizable, still magnificent after 2 millennia, but because human attention moved elsewhere. A city is not buildings but people, stone, but the life that animates it. When the people left, when the purposes that had justified Petra's existence evaporated, the carved facades became tombs in more than their original function. They became monuments to a vanished way of life, to prosperity that had seemed permanent, but proved as temporary as morning mist in the desert sun. Most of these facades are indeed tombs, elaborate houses for the dead, carved to impress, to demonstrate wealth and status, to provide eternal rest in chambers that would never decay. The irony is profound. The monuments to the dead outlasted the cities of the living. The tombs remain while the actual dwellings, built of less permanent materials, have mostly disappeared. What we see now in Petra is largely a necropolis, a city of the dead that appears more substantial than the living city it served. We close, standing before these rose-red cliffs as sunset approaches, as the stone begins its evening transformation from pink to crimson to ember. The light is soft, horizontal, painting the facades with warmth that makes them seem to glow from within, as if the rock itself holds some internal fire that only reveals itself at day's end. And we contemplate the lesson Petra teaches, that permanence is always relative, always temporary, always conditional on factors beyond our control. The Nabateans carved their city from solid stone, mastered water in the desert, built wealth on trade routes that seemed eternal. Yet their kingdom faded, their city emptied, their names were forgotten except by scholars reading ancient texts. Even rock can be forgotten when human attention moves elsewhere. Even the most solid architecture eventually stands empty, speaking only to wind and the occasional traveler who wanders through, marveling at what was and can never be again. The desert reclaims everything eventually, not through violence, but through patient neglect, through the slow accumulation of sand and the gradual erosion of details, through the simple fact that without constant human maintenance, all our works return to the earth from which they came. The facades remain, blushing in the evening light. The treasury still stands at the end of the sick, still takes the breath of those who see it for the first time. The tombs still line the streets of the empty city, but the voices are gone. The camel bells are silent, and the only sound is wind moving through carved spaces, whispering secrets the stone can no longer remember, singing elegies for a prosperity that seemed infinite, but lasted barely 500 years. Perhaps that is long enough. Perhaps we are not meant to endure forever. Perhaps even stone eventually grows tired of holding shape, ready to return to sand, to dust, to the desert that gave it form, and will one day take it back entirely. The sun sets, the stone cools, the rose fades to shadow, and Petra sleeps in the embrace of the desert, dreaming of the caravans that will never come again, remembering water and channels that have run dry, patient as only stone can be, waiting in the silence where all cities eventually arrive. The voice speaking through stone. There is a stone that once held silence and now holds speech. It sits behind glass in the British Museum, modest in dimension, no taller than a man, no wider than his outstretched arms, bearing the weight of 3,000 years of Egyptian voice that had fallen into muteness. The stone itself is unremarkable, dark granodiorite, fractured at the corners, its surface covered in text inscribed in 3 different scripts, carved in 196 BCE to commemorate a decree by priests honoring the young pharaoh Ptolemy V. For centuries it lay buried near the town of Rosetta, forgotten, its message unread, its purpose unknown. But when it was unearthed in 1799 by French soldiers digging fortifications, when scholars first examined the inscriptions and recognized what they had found, this modest stone became a key. Not a key to treasure or territory, but to something far more precious. The ability to hear voices that had been silent for 16 centuries, to read words written when Rome was still a republic, to recover the language that had given us pyramid texts and love songs, administrative records, and hymns to gods whose worship had ceased before Christianity was born. Before the Rosetta Stone, Jup spoke only in images we could not comprehend. The temples stood covered in hieroglyphs, beautiful, precise, carved deep into limestone and sandstone, painted in colors that still glowed after millennia. Birds and eyes, hands and water, symbols marching in neat columns across walls, filling tombs with text that looked sacred and mysterious and completely, utterly illegible. Scholars could recognize that these were not mere decoration. The arrangement was too purposeful, too systematic. These symbols clearly meant something. They were language, or had been language, representing sounds and concepts in ways we could no longer access. Obelisks had been carried from Egypt and erected in Rome, in Constantinople, in European capitals, their sides covered in these same mysterious symbols. They stood as trophies, as markers of imperial ambition, as decorative curiosities. But what they said remained unknown. The script had outlasted its readers. The last person who could read hieroglyphs had died sometime in the 4th or 5th century CE, as Egypt converted to Christianity and then to Islam, as the old temples were abandoned or repurposed, as the scribal schools that had trained generations in the complex art of reading and writing the script simply ceased to exist. The knowledge had not been destroyed violently. It had simply stopped being passed forward. And in the space of a few generations, what had been living language became dead symbol, beautiful but mute. This was the condition of ignorance in which Europe encountered Egyptian antiquity, awestruck by the monuments, tantalized by the inscriptions, but unable to read what ancient hands had written. Theories proliferated. Perhaps hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, each image representing a concept rather than sound. Perhaps they were mystical, encoding secret wisdom accessible only to initiates. Perhaps they were not truly language at all but elaborate decoration, religious art mistaken for text. All of this changed when Napoleon's soldiers, fortifying a position near Rosetta in the Nile Delta, unearthed a stone-bearing text in 3 scripts. The soldiers recognized its importance even without being scholars. One of their officers, Pierre-François Bouchard, understood that this was significant enough to preserve, to protect, to bring to the attention of the savants who had accompanied Napoleon's expedition to study Egyptian antiquities. When scholars examined the stone, they saw immediately what made it precious: the same text, repeated 3 times in different scripts. At the top, hieroglyphs 14 lines, damaged, but clearly the formal priestly script. In the middle, Demotic, the cursive Egyptian script used for everyday documents. And at the bottom, ancient Greek 34 lines, complete, readable. The Greek could be read. It was a decree from priests, praising Ptolemy V, listing his benefactions to temples, establishing the honors to be paid to the young king. And if the Greek said this, then surely the hieroglyphs above said the same thing. The stone was effectively bilingual, a translation key, a Rosetta Stone in the truest sense, a tool for moving between languages, for unlocking meaning that had been sealed. But recognition of the stone's importance came easier than the actual decipherment. This would require patience, brilliance, obsessive dedication, and more than 2 decades of scholarly labor. The emotional journey of decipherment is one of gradual resurrection, of learning to hear a voice that has been silent so long that even hearing it seems like miracle. Thomas Young, an English polymath, made the first crucial breakthrough. He identified that the oval rings called cartouches contained royal names. These were phonetic, not merely symbolic. The hieroglyphs could represent sounds, could spell out words in ways comparable to alphabetic scripts. But it was Jean-François Champollion, a French scholar who had devoted his life to Egyptian studies, who achieved the full decipherment. In 1822, working with the Rosetta Stone and other bilingual texts, he had his moment of realization. Hieroglyphs were not purely phonetic nor purely symbolic, but a complex system using both principles simultaneously. Some signs represented sounds, others represented concepts. Some did both, depending on context. The script was more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, capable of extraordinary nuance and precision. When Champollion grasped this, when he could suddenly read names and then words and then sentences, he is said to have run to his brother's office, shouted, "Je tiens l'affaire, I've got it," and collapsed from the emotional intensity of the breakthrough. He had recovered a voice. He had learned to hear across 3 millennia. The atmosphere must remain hushed here, reverential before the magnitude of what was achieved. Because with each word decoded, Egypt spoke again, not in the voices of tour guides interpreting monuments, not in the speculations of scholars theorizing about symbols, but in its own voice, in the actual words written by ancient hands. Kings addressed their subjects, proclaiming victories and building projects. Priests recorded rituals, the precise steps for ceremonies honoring gods whose worship had ceased. Scribes noted harvests and taxes, the mundane record-keeping that reveals daily life more clearly than any monument. Poets praised love with images that still resonate. My heart remembers your love. Half my temple is braided, while I run to see you, and I neglect my hair. Parents mourn dead children. Physicians recorded treatments. Teachers copied wisdom literature for students to practice their writing. The mundane and sacred both returned to comprehension, and with them returned not just information but intimacy, the sense of actual people thinking and feeling in ways we recognize, expressing themselves in a language that had fallen silent, but was never truly lost, only waiting for someone to remember how to hear it. The Rosetta Stone made this possible. Without that bilingual text providing the key, hieroglyphs might still be beautiful mysteries, decorations we admire without understanding, voices we hear as music without comprehending words. But there are other scripts that still wait for their Rosetta Stone, still guard their silence against all attempts at recovery. Linear A, the Minoan script we explored in an earlier chapter, remains undeciphered. We have tablets, we have signs, we have what is clearly systematic writing, but without a bilingual text, without some anchor to a known language, the script stays locked. We can count symbols and analyze frequency, but we cannot hear the voice. Etruscan, spoken by the civilization that predated Rome and Italy, is partially understood enough to read names and simple inscriptions, enough to know it is unrelated to Latin or Greek or any other Indo-European language. But longer texts remain opaque. We lack the Rosetta Stone that would unlock Etruscan literature, would let us hear their myths and histories in their own words rather than through Roman descriptions. Rongorongo, the script of Easter Island, might be writing or might be mnemonic symbols, aids for recalling oral texts rather than full phonetic encoding of language. The tablets that survive are few, their contexts unclear. The last people who could read them died before anyone thought to systematically record their knowledge. Now, we have the symbols but not the voice, the notation but not the song. These scripts wait. They wait for discovery, a bilingual text buried in some tomb, hidden in some cave, misidentified in some museum collection. Or they wait for brilliance, for someone who can see patterns others have missed, who can find the key without the obvious anchor of parallel translation. The chapter closes contemplating the mystery of language itself, of how sounds become symbols and symbols become vessels capable of carrying thought across centuries. Writing is humanity's attempt to transcend mortality, to speak beyond the grave, to ensure that what we know and feel and understand is not limited to our individual lifespans, but can be passed forward, preserved, maintained across the generations. But writing can fail. When the last reader dies, when the tradition breaks, when the knowledge stops being transmitted, the symbols remain but the voice falls silent. The text exists, but cannot be heard. Like a recording played on a device no one remembers how to operate. Yet meaning is not destroyed, only sealed. The Rosetta Stone proved this. The hieroglyphs were always meaningful, always language, always containing the thoughts and words of actual people. They simply needed someone to remember how to listen, to find the key that would unlock silence and restore speech. And so we stand before the possibility that other sealed languages might speak again. That somewhere, in some unstudied corner of an archive, in some undiscovered tomb, in some fragment overlooked for decades, a key waits. A bilingual text, a systematic explanation, a pattern that makes clear what has been mysterious. The past insists on being heard, patient as stone, waiting for the moment when someone has the insight, the knowledge, the determination to recover what was lost. The Rosetta Stone sits behind its glass, modest and eternal, its three scripts still visible, still readable, still performing the miracle of translation it has performed for over 2 millennia. It speaks in hieroglyphic, in Demotic, in Greek, and through it, all of Egypt speaks again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet persistent voice of writing that survives its writers, of meaning that outlasts understanding, of language that waits in stone, till someone remembers how to hear. Perhaps this is the real gift. Not that we can read hieroglyphs now, but that we learned we could recover what seemed utterly lost. That silence is not always final. That voices can be resurrected. That the past will speak again if we are patient enough, attentive enough, devoted enough to listen. The stone waits, other scripts wait, and somewhere in the silence where meaning rests sealed, voices prepare to speak again. We need only find the key. We need only remember how to listen. And the past, which has been waiting longer than we can imagine, will finally be heard once more. The labyrinth beneath the earth, there is a thread unwinding in the darkness, leading towards something that waits at the center of the world. This is the story everyone knows. Theseus descending into the labyrinth, Ariadne's thread clutched in one hand, a sword in the other, moving through turns and passages too complex for memory, seeking the monster at the maze's heart. The Minotaur, half-man, half-bull, prowling corridors that shift and twist, that double back on themselves, that create a prison more perfect than any cage, because the captive himself cannot find the way out. And the sacrifices, 7 youths and 7 maidens sent from Athens every 9 years, tribute paid to Minos, king of Crete, offered to the beast that dwells in darkness below his palace. It is myth. It is legend. It is the kind of story that feels true in the way dreams feel true, carrying weight and meaning even when literal truth seems distant. But beneath the myth, there is stone. There is archaeology. There is Knossos. When Arthur Evans began excavating the palace at Knossos in 1900, he unearthed something that changed our understanding of what myth might remember. The palace was vast, far larger than he expected, more complex than seemed reasonable for Bronze Age architecture. Over 1,000 rooms, he eventually calculated, spread across multiple stories, connected by corridors and staircases that turned unexpectedly, that led to chambers that led to more passages that opened onto courtyards from which more doorways beckon. To walk through Knossos even today, even in ruins, is to experience disorientation. The layout refuses to resolve into simple patterns. Central courtyards are surrounded by wings that extend irregularly. Storerooms give way to throne rooms, give way to shrines, each transition unmarked, each space flowing into the next without clear boundaries. There are staircases that ascend to vanished upper floors, corridors that end in walls, passages that curve back toward where you began without your quite realizing the turning. This is not impossible architecture. It is not magic. It is simply complexity, the accumulated result of centuries of building and rebuilding, of additions and modifications, of a palace that grew organically rather than according to a single predetermined plan. But entering it as an outsider, without knowledge of its layout, without the familiarity that comes from daily habitation, one could wander lost for hours. Add the complication of darkness. Many interior chambers have no windows, no direct access to sunlight, and the experience becomes genuinely labyrinthine. Imagine navigating these passages by torchlight, shadows dancing on walls painted with dolphins and griffins and priestesses, the flame-revealing corridors that stretch into darkness, doorways that might lead deeper in or might, if you're fortunate, lead back toward open air. The emotional arc moves from surface to depth, from the known palace to the mystery that lies below. Because beneath Knossos, beneath the floors Evans excavated, the earth is not solid. Limestone underlies the region, and limestone is soluble, carved by water over geological time into caves and passages, chambers connected by natural tunnels, spaces that humans did not create but might have discovered, might have used, might have transformed into something sacred. It is said that caves beneath the palace were known to Minoan priests, that they conducted initiations in these subterranean spaces, leading chosen individuals down into darkness as part of mystery rites whose nature we can only reconstruct from fragments and comparative religion. Did initiates descend through concealed entrances in the palace floor? Did they move through natural passages enhanced by carved chambers? Did they experience the labyrinth not as architectural complexity, but as literal journey into earth, into the underworld, into the realm of death and transformation from which they would emerge if they emerged changed? We explore Minoan culture now through the lens of the labyrinth, seeing how the symbol threads through their art and ritual. The bull is everywhere in Minoan iconography, not just as decoration, but as sacred presence. Bull leaping appears in frescoes, acrobats vaulting over the horns of charging bulls in displays that seem impossible, that suggest either artistic exaggeration or a lost technique, a mastery of timing and courage that allowed humans to dance with these dangerous creatures. Why bulls? Perhaps because they represented power, virility, the untamed force of nature that must be confronted, mastered, transformed through ritual contact. The bull becomes symbol of what is wild within and without, the aspect of existence that cannot be domesticated, but might, through courage and skill, be temporarily controlled. And the Minotaur, the bull-headed man, becomes the ultimate expression of this symbolism. Not quite human, not quite animal, dwelling in darkness, demanding sacrifice, representing perhaps the shadow self that dwells in each of us, the beast within that must be faced in the labyrinth of psychological transformation. Priestesses appear in frescoes wearing elaborate dresses, their bodices open, snakes writhing in their upraised hands. These are not servants but authorities, figures of power, conductors of rites we can only imagine. Were they the ones who led initiates into the labyrinth below? Were they keepers of mysteries that required descent into earth, into darkness, into the confrontation with whatever terror or truth awaited in the deepest chambers? The sacred symbol of the double axe, the Labyrinth, appears carved into walls, painted on pottery, rendered in gold and ivory. Some scholars believe the word labyrinth derives from Labyrinth, suggesting the maze was the place of the double axe, a sanctuary dedicated to the symbol. Others connect it to labyrinthus, a pre-Greek word whose meaning is lost, but whose sound suggests architectural complexity, passages, chambers, spaces designed for ritual rather than habitation. The atmosphere deepens into one of initiation, a transformation through ordeal. Mazes have psychological power that transcends their physical reality. To walk a labyrinth, whether literal architecture or ritual pattern traced on floor or ground, is to enact a journey. You enter uncertain, you move through confusion, you reach a center where something significant occurs, a revelation, confrontation, a moment of recognition, and then you return, following the path back out, emerging changed by whatever happened in that central chamber. This is the structure of initiation in cultures worldwide: separation from ordinary life, a liminal period of confusion and testing, and finally reintegration as someone transformed. The labyrinth becomes architecture that embodies this journey, that makes psychological transformation into physical movement through space. Theses' thread is the key to this understanding. Without it, the labyrinth is inescapable. You enter and cannot find your way out, doomed to wander until exhaustion or the Minotaur claims you. But with the thread, you remain connected to the entrance, to the world above, to the possibility of return. You can descend into darkness knowing you have the means to ascend again. What does the thread represent? Memory, perhaps the ability to recall the path you've taken, to reconstruct your journey. Or guidance, the wisdom passed from those who have gone before, the knowledge that transformation is possible, that others have descended and returned. Or connection, the link to those who love you, who wait above, who hold the other end of the thread and will pull if you lose your way. And the Minotaur? Perhaps it was never a literal monster. Perhaps it was the terror that dwells in darkness, the fear we must face when we descend into our own depths. The beast within that represents everything we would rather not confront about ourselves: our violence, our desires, our capacity for cruelty, our animalistic nature that civilization pretends to have transcended, but which remains prowling the corridors of the unconscious. To enter the labyrinth is to agree to face this. To walk its passages is to move toward confrontation with the shadow self. To slay the Minotaur is to integrate what was rejected, to acknowledge what was denied, to transform through acceptance rather than through continued repression. The chapter closes in the caves beneath Knossos, in complete and utter darkness where no sunlight has ever reached, where the only illumination comes from torches that create more shadow than light. Imagine standing here, imagine the weight of stone above, the sense of earth pressing down, the knowledge that you are beneath the palace, beneath the world of sun and air. in a realm that belongs to other powers, older forces, the chthonic deities who dwell below. A guide moves ahead, torch held high, leading the way through passages that branch and turn, through chambers whose ceilings drip with water that has been filtering through limestone for millennia. The walls are wet, reflecting firelight in patterns that seem almost alive, almost intentional, as if the stone itself is speaking in a language of shadow and gleam. You follow, because to do otherwise is to be lost in darkness, so complete that you cannot see your own hand before your face. You trust the guide, or you trust the thread you've been holding, some connection to the world above, some means of return. But you cannot help wondering, does this passage lead toward the center or away from it? Are we descending or ascending? How deep does the earth go? What waits in the chamber we cannot yet see? The atmosphere is thick with mineral smell, with the scent of ancient water and stone, with something else, to incense perhaps, or the residue of ceremonies conducted here long ago, or simply the accumulated must of time itself. And in the silence between footsteps, in the pauses when the guide stops to check the path, you can almost hear something. Not quite sound, not quite silence. Something between the echo of what was, the whisper of what might be, the presence of what dwells in labyrinths, whether carved by hands or hollowed by water or created in the spiraling passages of the mind. The Minotaur may have been metaphor, but metaphors have power. They shape how we understand ourselves, how we navigate the complexity of consciousness, how we frame the journey into our own depths, and the struggle to return transformed rather than destroyed. The labyrinth remains partly ruins above ground where tourists now walk with guidebooks and cameras, partly natural caves below where darkness still reigns, where passages still twist through limestone, where someone willing to descend might still experience something of what initiates felt 3,000 years ago. It invites entry. It always has. The path spirals inward, toward a center where something waits: revelation or terror, transformation or death, the Minotaur or the truth about ourselves. And the thread unwinds, held in trembling hands, the only link to the world above, to the possibility of return, to the hope that what we find in darkness will not destroy us, but remake us. The torch flickers. The passage continues. The labyrinth keeps its mysteries still. And somewhere in the turning of the path, in the descent into stone and self, the ancient invitation remains: enter, if you dare, and face what dwells at the center. You may emerge transformed. You may not emerge at all, but the labyrinth will be here, patient as earth itself, waiting for the next soul willing to walk its spiraling path into the heart of mystery. The ember that will not die. There is a flame burning in the temple, and it must never go out. This is not metaphor. This is duty, sacred and absolute. In the heart of Rome, in the circular temple dedicated to Vesta, goddess of hearth and home, a fire burns that represents the city's very life force. 6 priestesses, the Vestal virgins, chosen as children, consecrated for 30 years of service, maintain constant vigil. They add wood when the flame diminishes. They shield it from wind and rain. They watch through the night, ensuring that what their predecessors tended is passed forward unbroken, that the chain of fire stretches uninterrupted from Rome's mythical founding to whatever future awaits. If the flame goes out, catastrophe will follow. Not as punishment from angry gods, though the Romans believed that too, but as the severing of continuity, the breaking of a link that connects present to past, the extinguishing of something essential to identity itself. The flame is memory made visible. It is tradition rendered as light. It is the insistence that what we are depends on what we were, that the present cannot exist without this continuous connection to origin, to source, to the fire that has burned since the beginning. The Vestals understand this in ways that transcend theology. Their lives are devoted to continuity. They do not marry. They do not bear children. Their lineage is not biological but spiritual, passed through the act of tending, of watching, of maintaining what was entrusted to them. Each Vestal trains her successor, teaching the precise rituals, the careful attention required, the sacred responsibility of keeping alive what must not die. For over 1,000 years, they succeed. Through the Republic and into the Empire, through wars and plagues and political upheavals, through fires that consume whole districts of the city, the sacred flame in Vesta's temple continues burning. It becomes symbol not just of Rome, but of Rome's permanence, its claim to eternal existence, its conviction that what was founded will endure forever. But no flame burns forever without tending, and Rome, like all empires, eventually falls. The emotional arc expands now to embrace eternal flames across cultures, revealing how humanity returns repeatedly to this symbol of persistence, of light maintained against encroaching darkness. Because Rome was not alone in understanding fire's power as metaphor and practice both. In Persia, Zoroastrian fire temples maintained sacred flames for centuries. Some burned still flames lit before Islam's arrival in the 7th century, tended through conquest and conversion, and the slow transformation of religious landscape. These are not eternal in the absolute sense. They require fuel, maintenance, the devoted attention of priests who understand their duty as sacred trust. But they have burned for over a millennium, connecting modern Iran to the Sasanian Empire, to Achaemenid Persia, to traditions older than written history in the region. The fire represents Ahura Mazda, the divine light that stands against darkness, truth against falsehood, order against chaos. To maintain the flame is to maintain this cosmic balance, to participate in the eternal struggle between illumination and shadow. Zoroastrian priests trained for years in the proper rituals how to add fuel without letting smoke contaminate the purity of flame, how to transfer fire from one vessel to another, without extinguishing it, how to maintain reverence before what is both physical combustion and divine presence. In Greece, the Olympic flame burns in 4-year cycles, each lighting a deliberate recreation of ancient practice. Modern organizers relight the flame at Olympia using parabolic mirrors to focus sunlight, connecting contemporary games to their classical origin through unbroken symbolism, if not continuous burning. The flame travels carried by runners, transported by ship and plane, passed hand to hand across continents until it reaches the host city where it will burn throughout the games before being ceremonially extinguished. This is eternal flame as resurrection, as periodic renewal rather than constant maintenance. The fire acknowledges that some traditions cannot be continuous, that history breaks them, that revival requires conscious act of reconnection, but the impulse remains, to light a flame that links present to past, that makes tangible the continuity of human gathering for athletic competition and celebration. In synagogues, the Enter Tamid, the eternal light, burns above the ark containing Torah scrolls. It represents the menorah that burned in the temple in Jerusalem, the 7-branched candelabra that was to be kept continually lit. When the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE, when the physical menorah was carried away as spoils of war, Jewish communities maintained the symbol, installing eternal lights in their houses of worship, ensuring that what could not be preserved as artifact endured as practice. The flame becomes memory of temple, reminder of continuity despite diaspora and persecution, insistence that though the building is destroyed, the tradition persists. Some eternal lights are oil lamps, some are electric now, but the symbolism remains unchanged. This light does not go out, because we will not let it go out, because keeping it burning is how we maintain connection to ancestors who lit similar flames, who passed forward the tradition that we now carry. In churches, the Paschal candle burns through the Easter season, representing Christ as light of the world, illumination that defeats death's darkness. It is lit from new fire blessed during Easter Vigil, burns throughout the 50 days until Pentecost, then is set aside to be used only for baptisms, initiating new members into the tradition, passing forward the light to those who will carry it into the next generation. At Arlington National Cemetery, an eternal flame burns at John F. Kennedy's grave, lit by his widow at his funeral, and maintained continuously since. It is not ancient, not religious in the traditional sense, but it partakes of the same symbolism. Memory kept alive through persistent light, honor maintained through constant vigilance, refusal to let darkness claim what was significant, who was significant, what was lost. The chapter deepens now into what these flames represent beyond their literal burning. Because fire is the most fragile of the persistent elements, water remains in ocean and lake, even when we stop watching. Stone endures through neglect, But fire requires constant attention. It demands fuel, oxygen, protection from elements that would extinguish it. To maintain eternal flame is to commit to eternal vigilance, to accept that continuity requires active choice, renewed in every moment, every day, every generation. The Vestals did not simply keep fire, they embodied continuity in a civilization obsessed with its own permanence. Rome built monuments to last forever, created laws intended for eternal application, conceived of itself as urbs aeterna, the eternal city. But monuments crumble, laws are revised or abandoned, cities fall. What persisted was not stone but flame, not architecture, but the living practice of tending what must not be extinguished, until it was. In 394 CE, Emperor Theodosius I ordered the fire extinguished as part of his campaign to establish Christianity as Rome's sole religion. The Vestal order was disbanded, the temple was closed, and the flame that had burned for over 1,000 years, that had survived the sack by Gauls in 390 BCE, that had been maintained through civil wars and imperial transitions, was deliberately put out. This was not accident, this was choice. And it marked not just the end of a religious practice, but the severing of a link that had stretched back to Rome's mythical founding, to Romulus and Remus, to the moment when the city came into being. With the extinguishing of the flame, something essential was lost, not just light, but continuity, not just tradition, but the living connection between present and past that the flame had represented. Yet Rome lived on in other forms. The city persisted. The idea of Rome survived the empire's fall, passed into Byzantine continuation, into medieval aspiration, into the revival that gave us Renaissance rebirth, relighting of the flame that had seemingly gone out. Perhaps this is the deeper truth, that flames can be relit, that traditions can be recovered, that what seems extinguished might hold embers still, waiting for oxygen and fuel to burst into flame again. The tone softens now into contemplative meditation, moving toward closure that is not conclusion, but opening, invitation to wonder rather than answer. We reflect on what it means to maintain knowledge, tradition, memory across generations. Writing helps texts preserve information, even when no one reads them, waiting for future readers to recover what was written. But writing alone is insufficient. Words on page cannot teach you how to perform a ritual, how to add wood to sacred fire, how to move through ceremonial space with the reverence practice requires. Some knowledge lives only in practice, in the doing, in the transmission from teacher to student through demonstration and repetition, and the slow embodiment that comes only through years of attention. To tend eternal flame is to participate in this transmission. Each generation receives the fire from the previous one, maintains it through their years of vigilance, passes it forward to successors who will carry it beyond their lifetimes. The flame they tend is the same flame, not metaphorically, but literally, if maintained unbroken, that their ancestors tended, that their descendants will tend a physical link across time that makes continuity tangible in a way that stories and texts alone cannot achieve. Some flames continue burning. Zoroastrian fire temples maintain their ancient practice. Jewish eternal lights glow above arcs in synagogues worldwide. The Olympic flame will be relit at Olympia in future years, as it has been for nearly a century of modern games. Kennedy's flame burns on its hillside, tended by mechanisms now rather than human hands, but burning still. Some flames have been extinguished and relit. The sacred fire at Olympia went dark when the games were banned, burned again when the games were revived. Traditions interrupted by catastrophe, by conquest, by conversion, have been recovered, practices re-established, flames kindled anew from ember memory or deliberate recreation. And some flames remain dark. The Vestal flame will not burn again in its original form. The context that made it meaningful, polytheistic Rome with its constellation of deities and civic rituals, no longer exists. To relight it now would be recreation, historical reenactment, not living tradition. Yet its memory persists, passed forward in texts and archaeology, in the concept of eternal flame that other cultures adopted, in the recognition that fire can symbolize continuity, that light maintained against darkness is worth the vigilance it requires. The chapter ends in quiet gratitude, not triumphant but humble, acknowledging all who have tended embers across generations, who have passed forward light that allows us to see backward into time's deep chambers. Because every tradition we inherit, every practice we maintain, every knowledge we possess is the result of someone tending the flame, choosing to pass forward what they received, accepting responsibility for continuity, ensuring that what mattered to their ancestors would be available to their descendants. We are those descendants. We stand in the light that others maintain, and we face the same choice. Will we tend what has been passed to us? Will we add fuel against the wind that would extinguish? Will we keep vigil through the night, accepting the sacred duty of continuity, ensuring that the next generation receives the flame still burning? Some will, some must, because the alternative is darkness, forgetting, the severing of links that connect us to those who came before and those who will come after. The flame flickers but does not fail. Not yet. Not while someone watches, someone tends. Someone accepts responsibility for keeping alive what must not die. And perhaps that is enough. Not permanence, which is impossible, but persistence, which requires only will and attention, and the conviction that light matters, that memory deserves maintenance, that the ember we carry is worth protecting against the darkness that waits patient and eternal for the moment of our inattention. The fire burns on, somewhere, always somewhere, tended by hands we will never know, passed to others we will never meet, but burning still, insisting on continuity, refusing extinction. The ember that will not die, because we will not let it.